A 7-year-old girl stood crying by her mother's grave, insisting that her mom was still alive. The whole town believed she was delusional, until a retired doctor, unable to ignore what he heard, felt compelled to act. Driven by an unexplainable urge, he decided to dig up the grave, and what he uncovered would shake everyone to their core. A secret buried for years, a death that wasn't an accident, but a carefully hidden conspiracy. What really happened to the mother? Stay tuned to uncover the truth. That afternoon, the wind was eerily still. On the sun-bleached hill of Silverbrook Cemetery, a little girl with tangled hair and a worn, dark wool dress sat beside a freshly covered grave. She clutched a threadbare teddy bear tightly in her arms, her head resting on a tombstone still wet with paint. Emma Barrett, beloved mother of Lily. Dr. Harold Green, a retired physician visiting his wife's grave, as he did every weekend, nearly walked past the girl. But he froze when he heard a trembling whisper escape her lips. "Mommy, I hear you calling. You're still alive. You're calling me from down there." He went still, not because of the words, but because of her eyes. When Lily looked up, there was no panic in her gaze, only a chilling certainty that lit her face. This wasn't a child imagining things. It was as if she knew it was true. Harold stepped closer and sat beside her. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily Barrett," she whispered. My mom isn't dead." That voice didn't tremble. It was quiet but firm, like a command issued to the world. Harold swallowed hard. The name Barrett sounded familiar. Had he seen it in an old file while sifting through archived medical records? Or was it just coincidence that his wife had passed at the same hospital where this woman, Emma, had died? "You hear your mother calling?" he asked. "Yes, every night. She says, 'Lily, it's me. I haven't left. I can hear her clearly.'" Harold's hand tightened around the carved wooden handle of his cane. A chill slipped past the layers of his coat. At 62, he'd witnessed his share of strange things, but nothing had ever unsettled him quite like the unwavering belief coming from a 7-year-old child. That evening, he didn't go straight home. Instead, he parked his car outside Hillstone Hospital, the place where Emma Barrett had been declared dead from a stroke just 2 weeks ago. The death certificate was signed the same day. No autopsy had been performed. Why would a child be so sure her mother wasn't dead? Why had the hospital denied a request for exhumation, even from a family member? And why did Harold have the disturbing sense that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened? That final question echoed in his mind as night fell, and the first winter wind brought with it a sound he couldn't shake. Knock, knock, knock. Who was calling from beneath the ground? Dr. Harold Green sat motionless in his car, parked along the curb across from Hillstone Hospital. The neon lights from the emergency entrance cast a cold, bluish hue across his windshield. He didn't turn on the radio. No music. Just the slow, steady beat of his heart, like it was sifting through old memories. 4 years ago, Sarah, his wife, had been rushed into this very hospital after a sudden, crushing pain in her chest. She'd been healthy, no history of heart issues. But 2 hours after admission, he received a brief phone call. "Your wife didn't make it. Sudden cardiac arrest. We're very sorry." No further explanation. No chance to see her one last time. Just like the hospital's refusal to conduct an autopsy, citing a clearly determined cause. He, a doctor, a husband, had been pushed away from the door of truth in a single night. Harold hadn't filed a lawsuit, hadn't launched an inquiry. He quit medicine, sold his private practice, and disappeared from the world of healthcare. He told himself it was fate, that some things just happen. But Lily's eyes, the sound of her voice at her mother's grave, had shattered the shell of resignation he'd built around himself. The name Emma Barrett started to haunt him. Harold returned to the room where he kept old case files, medical records from patients he'd once treated. There was no file for Emma, of course, but he did find an unopened letter, postmarked 6 months ago from Hillstone Hospital, handwritten on the envelope, "To Dr. Green, urgent." He opened the letter. Inside was a single folded sheet, shaky, with scrawled handwriting. "They're killing people in silence. There are fake DNR orders. I'm scared, but I won't stay quiet anymore. If I disappear, please find Carla, the night shift head nurse. She knows the truth." Signed, Emma B. Harold read it 3 times, his heart pounded, blood roaring in his ears. This couldn't be a coincidence. This couldn't be just a child's imagination. Emma had tried to speak up, and now She was buried in the ground, with a daughter who swore her mother was still alive. Carla's name. He wrote it down. Head nurse. He had to find her. He had to know what happened. The chill spread through Harold's chest. But this time, it wasn't the weather. It was that old, familiar feeling stirring back to life. The deep unease of knowing he once turned his back on a cry for help. And this time, he wouldn't make that mistake again. 2 days later, Dr. Harold Green returned to Hillstone Hospital, not as a grieving husband, but as a man following the trail of a buried cry for help. He went straight to the nurse's station and asked to speak with the night shift head nurse, Carla Morrison. The receptionist looked puzzled. "Carla resigned 3 weeks ago," the young woman said, her voice flat and rehearsed. "We don't have her contact information." Harold frowned slightly. "That's not possible. She worked here for over 10 years. She just disappeared and no one knows why?" The woman pressed her lips together as if afraid of being overheard. "I don't know the full story, but she seemed scared. Before she left, Carla was crying in the break room, said someone was watching her. Then she vanished." Harold nodded his thanks and walked away. But he didn't leave the hospital. He headed down to the cafeteria where staff gathered after shifts. There, he found an old acquaintance, Nurse Mark Reyes, once a student of his back when Harold taught at med school. Reyes was stunned to see him. They shook hands. Less than 10 minutes later, tucked away in a quiet corner of the staff lounge, Harold leaned in and whispered, "I need to know what happened to Carla, and to a patient named Emma Barrett." Reyes was silent. He glanced around, then locked the door. "You know, ever since Carla disappeared, no one dares talk about it anymore. But I've heard a few things." He lowered his voice. "Carla used to push back against signing DNR orders without family consent. One time, she crossed out a do not resuscitate order after realizing it wasn't valid. After that, she was suddenly reassigned, her pay was cut, and she was threatened with a lawsuit for violating protocol. A week later, Carla pulled her file, quit, and vanished." Harold nodded, a heaviness settling in his chest. It was all starting to unfold, a network of wrongdoing hidden beneath layers of paperwork, power, and fear. "Did Emma ever say anything to you?" Harold asked. Reyes hesitated. "Once. She showed me a notebook. It was full of patient names, people with DNRs their families never authorized. The next day, the notebook was gone. She said she had a copy, but I never saw it again. That notebook, it was the key. And if Emma had sent Harold a letter, there was a good chance she'd hidden the backup somewhere, a way to protect the truth if she couldn't speak it aloud." Harold left the hospital as twilight settled over the city. On the way home, he stopped by Silverbrook Cemetery. Lily was still there, clutching her teddy bear in silence. "I'm looking for your mother's notebook," he said gently. Lily looked up, eyes shining. "Mom told me not to let anyone take it, but I trust you." From inside the teddy bear, she pulled out a small, neatly folded slip of paper. On it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, P.O. Box 183, Maplewood Post Office. Code Barrett 123. Harold stared at the note, feeling everything begin to shift. The secrets were no longer buried forever. The next morning, Harold Green drove to the Maplewood Post Office, a small, old red brick building tucked along the highway. The early wind was sharp, carrying with it a chill and a growing sense of dread in his chest. Box 183 sat at the end of the row. Harold slid in the key, heart pounding. The metal door creaked open. Inside was a thick brown envelope with no return address. He got back in the car, locked the doors, and opened the envelope. Inside were a small notebook, a USB drive, and a handwritten note from Emma. "If you've found this, I may already be gone, but please don't let what I discovered stay buried. I copied all of Hillstone Hospital's irregular records onto this USB. The notebook contains names of patients who were forced into DNR status. They didn't die from illness. They were allowed to die. For money." Harold felt his heart skip a beat. He flipped through the notebook. Names, ages, admission dates, medical status. Many had been stable, with only minor symptoms. Yet all had died within 48 hours of admission, officially due to natural cardiac arrest. Most were elderly patients without close family supervision. The final page had a note. Several death certificates were signed by the same doctor, Dr. Vernon Hale. Check his financial records. The money isn't coming from the hospital. Dr. Vernon Hale. The name sliced through Harold's memory like a thin blade. A former colleague, once a skilled ER doctor, later entangled in several financial scandals. No charge had ever stuck, but everyone knew he wasn't clean. Harold plugged the USB into his home computer. The files were barely encrypted, easy to access. There were scanned DNR orders with forged signatures, names of family members written in mismatched handwriting. There was even an audio recording Emma had secretly made while being pressured by her superiors. "If you keep pushing this, Emma, I can't guarantee your safety. Best to stay in line." The man's voice, cold, threatening. He didn't say his name, but Harold knew it was Walter Kinnear, CEO of Hillstone Hospital, a notoriously private man with deep ties to private healthcare investment funds. Suddenly, Harold heard the screech of brakes outside. He walked to the window, pulled back the curtain. A black SUV had parked just a few houses down. 4 men in black suits stepped out, silent, staring toward his home. A chill crawled up his spine. They knew. They were watching. Harold stepped back, heart pounding. He'd come too far to turn back now, and that was exactly why he couldn't stop. Harold sat in his study, the dim glow from his desk lamp casting soft shadows over the scattered papers and documents around him. He was trying to verify the details in the files left by Emma Barrett, the nurse from Hillstone Hospital who had vanished months ago. All the evidence pointed to Emma uncovering a major scandal involving forged DNR orders, something the hospital staff was desperately trying to cover up. But what troubled him most were the whispers surrounding her death. It might not have been the accident they claimed. As he worked, a soft knock echoed through the room. Harold flinched, but motioned toward the door. It opened slowly, revealing a thin, pale girl with sorrowful eyes. It was Lily, Emma's daughter. "Dr. Harold, my mom told me to come see you," she said softly, her expression serious and filled with worry. She clutched a small, tightly sealed box in her hands. Harold recognized it instantly. It was the set of documents Emma had prepared before she disappeared. "Can I trust you?" he asked gently, his eyes locked onto hers. Lily nodded, her eyes fixed on the box. "Mom said you'd help us. She recorded everything in there. I can't keep it anymore. The people looking for you, they're not good. Mom told me to protect these things." Harold took the box from her and nodded, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. "You did the right thing, but now we need to find a way to make clear what your mother uncovered." Before he could say more, a loud noise came from outside the door. Steady footsteps were approaching Harold's house. He looked at Lily, his eyes urgent. "You need to go now. Don't let them find you." Lily looked at him in panic, but Harold didn't have time to explain further. He pushed her toward the back door where a car was waiting. "You need to leave. Give the box to someone you trust. Don't let them know about the documents." Harold rushed back to his study, hastily packing the evidence while hearing the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Fear surged inside him. He didn't have much time left. "Don't get caught," he told himself. If he didn't act now, these files would be buried forever. Harold hurried to the back door, his heart racing. Behind him, the black SUV had stopped in front of his house, and the people inside weren't innocent. They had arrived. Harold sat silently before the small box, his heart racing as he continued to flip through the documents. Each page, each postcard, and each note brought back painful memories of Sarah, his wife, who had passed away not long ago. Her death had always been a great question in his heart. Though it was confirmed to be from a car accident, deep down, Harold had always felt that something wasn't right. One of the papers he flipped to immediately made him stop. It was a copy of the DNR order that Emma had found and recorded in her notes. DNR, do not resuscitate, a medical order for patients who no longer have a chance to live. However, on this document, his Sarah had been placed on the DNR list without any family consent. This was completely contrary to everything Harold knew about his wife's condition. He remembered that day, Sarah showed no signs of wanting to give up on life, but a piece of paper had been signed with her name, accepted at the hospital without his consent. This left Harold confused and suspicious. How could Sarah have signed a DNR when she was still conscious and had no intention of giving up? Harold took a deep breath, the pain rushing back. Perhaps this was what Emma had discovered before she disappeared. Sarah was not just a patient forgotten in the healthcare system. She was also a victim of a corrupt system hiding deaths with questionable causes. He continued to flip through the documents in the box. Emma's notes indicated that she had uncovered a network of doctors and nurses at the hospital where DNR orders were issued without the consent of the patient or their family. Each patient was like a number in the system. People managed to save costs for the hospital. And patients like Sarah, she was not the only case. Anger surged within Harold. Sarah wasn't just another patient. She had asked him to sign papers for her, but it was always clear that she wanted to live, and there was no legal DNR order signed before her passing. Suddenly, he remembered and sprang to his feet, rushing over to his desk. In front of him was an old photo of Sarah, smiling, happy, with no signs of facing a decision like this. Harold couldn't stop thinking about one haunting question. Could Sarah have been the victim of a wrong decision or even a deliberate action by the hospital? The documents in the box were beginning to lift the veil of truth. What Emma had found and what Harold was uncovering in these papers was not just related to his wife's death, but part of a bigger plan. Emma had died because she knew too much. And now it was Harold's turn to continue this investigation. That's why this box wasn't just a collection of documents. It was clear evidence of corruption, of the wrong decisions made by the system, and of what happened to Sarah. Her death was not natural. And with each page, Harold understood more that he couldn't stand still. He had to keep searching for the truth, not only to avenge Sarah, but also for the innocent lives being oppressed by this system. Harold carefully put the box away and looked out the window. The sun was setting, but the light inside him had never been stronger. He couldn't stop. He was no longer just a retired doctor. He was the only one who could bring the truth to light. Harold recalled the image of Lily, her face still wet with tears, her eyelashes trembling as though she was still trapped in a nightmare. He couldn't forget the whispered words from the little girl as she shuddered, looking at him. "Mom is still alive. She called me from under the ground." At first, Harold wanted to believe it was just a hallucination of a traumatized child, but now he wasn't so sure. Emma's notes, the falsified DNR orders, and a series of erased data from the medical center had painted a clear picture. Emma didn't die in an accident. She may have been silenced by someone. But if Emma truly died in the hospital, why fake the DNR? And why the mass disappearance of the monitoring records? He remembered an important detail he had overlooked. Emma's death certificate did not have a signature from an independent coroner, but only a stamp from the very medical center where she had worked, where Reed, the current director, held all the power. He decided he had to exhume Emma's body. It wasn't easy for someone without blood ties to request the exhumation of a body, but Harold found a loophole. In the burial registration, the person who signed on behalf of the next of kin was the legal guardian, Reed. This was illegal. Harold filed a complaint with the city council, along with supporting documents. While waiting, he reached out to an old friend who had worked as a forensic expert, Marcus, the only person he trusted enough to accompany him on this journey. Finally, on a night with light rain, they were granted permission to open the casket under restricted supervision. No one could have prepared for what they were about to see. The casket was opened, revealing the body of a woman. It was indeed Emma. But the strangeness wasn't in the identification. It was in the chaotic scratches inside the lid, where fingernails had been torn off and dried blood scattered, indicating that Emma had still been alive when she was buried. Marcus spoke softly, as if in disbelief. She woke up in the coffin, and no one heard her. Harold turned away, his throat tight. Now he knew Lily had been right, and the adults had been wrong. The little girl wasn't delusional. She was the only one who had heard the whispers from hell. Harold clenched his fists. The battle was no longer about investigation. It was about reclaiming the life that had been stolen and the justice buried with Emma. Harold sat in his office, in front of him a stack of papers he had carefully organized, photos of the scratches inside the coffin, a copy of the death certificate with the illegal signature, the forged DNR records, and a list of patients who had died in silence at Haven Crest Nursing Center. He knew he couldn't stay silent, not for Emma, but for the dozens, the hundreds of other victims, people who might have had their lives cut short to serve the humane death system that Reed continued to preach. Harold sent all the documents to 3 places, the local health department, an independent investigative journalist, and the town council. But he also knew that just having the evidence wouldn't be enough. He needed a direct confrontation so that the people who once believed in Havencrest could open their eyes. The opportunity came on Monday morning when Havencrest held a press conference to introduce their new Humane End-of-Life Care program with Dr. Reed as the keynote speaker. The small auditorium was packed, from the patients' families to local officials. As Reed was delivering his flowery words about the gentleness of a controlled death, Harold walked in, holding a black briefcase and an envelope of documents. "Excuse me, but there is someone who was not allowed to die gently," Harold said, his voice steady. "Her name was Emma Ward, and she was buried alive." The entire auditorium fell silent. Harold stepped up to the podium, pulling out each photograph and displaying them on the screen. The scratches inside the coffin, the broken fingernail, the excerpt of the forged DNR, and the confirmation that no valid autopsy had been conducted. He detailed each step, from Lily's whisper to the box of evidence, and finally to the night of the exhumation. Reed initially maintained his composure, but his gaze began to waver as Harold played the internal recording from the USB in Emma's box, a recording where a healthcare worker said, "Reed told me to sign. That patient wasn't to be resuscitated. His order. Would you care to explain why you signed on behalf of the patient's family?" Harold asked, his gaze burning with intensity. A reporter stood up. "Mr. Reed, do you have any response to these allegations?" Reed stammered, searching for someone to support him. But the faces around him had shifted, from respect to doubt, from agreement to horror. The security guard stepped forward, not to stop Harold, but to escort Dr. Reed out of the auditorium at the request of the town council representative. As he walked away, Harold's eyes never left him. The door to justice had opened, and Harold knew, this time, no one would be able to close it again. After the shocking press conference, Harold was called in to work with the state medical investigation agency. But this time, he was not alone. The evidence he provided, from the illegal death certificate, the recording from the USB Emma had left behind, to the forensic results from the exhumation, forced officials to open a comprehensive investigation into the Havencrest system. Through testimonies and analyzed data, the entire structure of the crime gradually emerged, like a sophisticated web shielded by layers of false morality. It turned out that the Havencrest system consisted of two branches: an inpatient hospital, where Emma had worked as a nurse, and a hospice care center, also known as Havencrest Nursing Home. Both were directly overseen by Dr. Reed, a well-known doctor in the medical community, often appearing in the media as an expert on the right to die and humane end-of-life care. Emma, while she was still alive, had discovered a chilling pattern. Elderly patients who weren't yet in critical condition were often marked with forged DNR orders, "Do not resuscitate," meaning they would not be resuscitated if their heart stopped. These orders were signed without the family's consent. Just days after being tagged with these orders, the patients were often transferred to the nursing home, and then they disappeared from the system. When Emma questioned the head of the department, her records were altered. She was reassigned from her regular shift and then disappeared just days after a private meeting with the board of directors. On paper, her death was listed as serious traffic accident, but no one ever saw her body, and the person handling the funeral arrangements, none other than Reed, who had been her doctor and managed her medical records. From Harold's account, the police uncovered 4 similar cases. Patients marked with fake DNRs, transferred to other facilities, disappeared, and their bodies returned with undetermined causes of death. The victims' estate records also revealed large payments made from their accounts after their deaths, some directed to charities founded by Reed. Even more horrifying, Reed had been the leading figure in a controversial study on safe death, where he preached that the elderly deserve a peaceful death rather than meaningless prolongation. Beneath the flowery rhetoric was a system that exploited legal loopholes to strip away lives and even profit from death. Looking back, Harold understood why Emma had sent him the evidence, not only because he was a doctor, but because he had once been part of that system. He had trusted Reed, once believing that liberation was sometimes humane. But now he saw true humanity wasn't in making decisions for others, but in protecting the right to live, to know and to choose. A month after the full truth came to light, Harold returned to the small garden behind the house where he used to plant the wild chrysanthemums that Sarah loved. For the first time in many years, he could touch the soil without feeling the guilt bleeding from every crack in his hands. The official investigation concluded with over 20 cases uncovered related to the Havencrest system, including fake DNR orders, falsified medical records, and systematic murder. Dr. Reed, once hailed as a symbol of humanitarianism in the medical field, was sentenced to life in prison without parole, on charges including conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of power, and financial fraud. But for Harold, Reed's sentence didn't bring a sense of victory. He only felt an empty silence, like the stillness after a fierce storm, because, in the end, he had discovered the truth about Sarah's death, the woman he had loved his entire life. That day, Sarah had not suffered a stroke as he had once thought. She was still conscious when she was brought to the hospital, and Emma, then an intern under his supervision, had seen the worry and fear in her eyes. But under pressure from higher-ups, Sarah was transferred to the DNR treatment ward and given an overdose of sedatives. No one resuscitated her. No one reported the truth. Emma had written it all down in her journal, and that very thing made her a thorn in Reed's side. When Harold reached the final lines of Emma's journal, he cried, not just because he had lost Sarah, but because he, the one who once believed he stood on the side of life, had unwittingly helped bring about death. Lily, once a bewildered little girl standing in a dark hallway, had now found her laughter again. She was moved to live with her aunt, Emma's younger sister, in a coastal town. Harold stayed in touch, sending her handwritten letters every month as a silent promise, "You're not alone." The town where everything had happened had now changed. An independent ethics committee was established. Emma's name was engraved on a memorial plaque in the hospital courtyard as someone who had sacrificed to protect the truth. For Harold, things had never been over, but neither were they filled with torment anymore. He had chosen to stand on the side of life, though late, and from then on he lived, not to forget, but to remember properly. That day, when Lily sent him a drawing, him and her mother standing together under a blooming wild chrysanthemum tree, he understood that from now on, no one would be buried alive in silence anymore.